So thank you everybody for joining us on our IBA webinar. My name is Steve. We are joined today by Michael Smith. He is a postdoctoral fellow in the Cousin Lab of the Department of Collective Behavior at the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior, Center for the Advanced Study of Collective Behavior at the University of Constance. His research uses automatic tracking to detect movement patterns in honeybee colonies to understand how individual bees detect the development state of their group. You started keeping bees in 2005 while attending college in Wales.
Yeah.
You get around, man. He continued keeping during his undergrad at Princeton and research at Wesley College with Heather Matilla. And in 2017, you completed your PhD in Tom Seeley's lab at Cornell University, where he studied growth development and reproductive investments in honeybee colonies. That's really impressive, man. Please, thank you for joining us. And when you're ready, go ahead.
Cool, right on. So let's see. So I'm going to give this a shot. I will share the screen. And okay. So can you see my screen okay?
Yeah.
And let's see if I play this. So, and if I play, does that show up?
Yeah, full screen, man. Yeah, you're cool.
Cool. And I guess the mouse is gigantic.
The mouse is the size of 2 letters. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. So, I mean, just so everyone knows, the reason I've made the mouse enormous is that typically, you know, when I talk about this kind of stuff, I can actually like point at things in the slide. And it kind of makes sense to have some kind of way to like kind of direct you to where I'm hoping you can look at. All right, cool. So, I mean, I guess we just head on, right?
Yep. When you're ready, man.
Cool. Right on. So, so yeah, actually, one thing to ask you, Stephen, is for any kind of questions that come up, will they pop up on my screen or?
Yeah, we'll get them at the bottom. See, there's a Q&A beside the picture of the little avatars. So if there's questions, guys, we won't interrupt the talk. We'll ask them at the end. So don't worry about questions just for now. We'll come back to them if that's okay.
All right, cool. And yeah, so please do. I mean, yeah, I'll give a couple of different spots where we can kind of see what people want to do. So for the meantime, I'm gonna play this. All right, so yeah, so we're gonna talk about sociometry today, and yeah, I hope it's interesting. And if not, well, I'm sorry. Anyways, okay, so yeah, so let's get right into it. So sociometry is maybe something that you haven't really thought about or heard about before, but if you think the word, sociometry is actually, it's two words together, and it's so you think of socio, like social insect colonies, and metry, like measuring the heck out of something. And it was a word coined by Walter Schinkel, who's actually an ant biologist. And so the way he defines sociometry is the description and analysis of physical and numerical attributes of social insect colonies over their whole lifetimes. And that's a really important thing, is that you're measuring things in the colony for the whole lifetime of the colony. So in the same way that maybe you would, think of like a human baby, and you'd say, okay, well, how big is a baby when it's born versus how big is a baby after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, to the point that they die. You could imagine like measuring that baby as it grows and develops and all that kind of stuff. So Walter Schinkel, unfortunately, he worked with ants. So this is Walter Schinkel right here. And his favorite research tool is actually a shovel, because he worked with fire ant colonies in the southern US, where you have nice, really sandy soil. And so he wrote at one point that, if this is digging a lot of deep holes, well, shovels are cheap and we can use the exercise. So he was really the champion of sociometry as something that we really need to understand about social insect colonies, is to just kind of sit back and look at them and measure them as best we can in whatever kind of thing we're interested about. And so that's kind of like the basis. So that's like the kind of the reason why this kind of stuff is important to do. So here's a ridiculously long list. This is actually from his paper, and you don't even try to read this. Don't even avoid. But what I'm trying to show you here is that there are a lot of things that you could try to measure. You could try to measure, how long it takes for the first reproduction. You could try to say, well, how long is the lifespan? What's the egg laying rate in different conditions? What's the size of the queen or the king, depending on what kind of colony you're working with? What's this, all these different things. So what I'm saying is that there's a lot that you could measure. And Walter Schinkel said it really nicely, was that his list was not exhaustive, though collecting these data could be exhausting. And so the idea is that sociometry is a very long and arduous kind of work, but it's really important work. And so I'm hoping that I can kind of convince you that these are kind of things that really need to be done across the social insects, and you know, kind of things that you can think about in other kind of different contexts as well. So you might well, and I think rightfully so, be asking yourself, well, like, who actually cares? You know, why do you care to actually measure these things? Why don't you just get in there and do an experiment? And the reason for that is that any kind of interesting process that you're interested in understanding, so like, how do the bees do this, or you know, how do they kind of handle this problem? For any kind of case, what you really need is you need to know the pattern before you can get at the process. So the example I'm putting over here on the side is, this is a lot of work that I did, was you have worker comb, which is this one size of hexagons up here that these bees build. And you have drone comb, which, you know, all of us beekeepers know about drone comb. We tend not to like it, but drone comb is important for a honeybee colony. It's how they reproduce and produce males. And so every single colony makes both this worker comb and this drone comb. And so you might want to understand what's the process of switching from worker comb to drone comb, but you'd really need to know what the pattern was like before you could actually understand the process. So for example, some kind of pattern questions you might want to know would be things like, you know, when do colonies build drone comb? How much of it do they actually build? What does a colony look like? What's their state when they start building drone comb? And then maybe you'd be interested also, like, how are these colonies using their drone comb early in their lives versus later in their lives? Kind of any of these kind of what I would call probably like really cool questions of, like, you know, how do bees decide to switch from building worker to building drone? You really need a solid foundation of a pattern to kind of be able to know that you're sitting on a strong foundation, that you're actually asking questions that are relevant to the biology of your organism. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, Michael, you know, you work with honeybees, which is the most well-studied social insect of them all. So of course, someone has already done this. But actually, surprisingly, it really hadn't been done in honeybees. So in a lot of previous cases, someone would be interested in just one thing, like let's say just honey. I'm really interested in how much honey a colony has. So we would just track one parameter, honey, and say, okay, how much honey does a colony have? And they would look at how much honey they had over the course of the life of that colony. But that's just honey, that's one part of it. You're not actually looking at the number of workers and how that relates to the amount of honey, or the time of year and how that relates to the amount of honey. Another problem that people would do is that they would work with fully mature, totally like fully sized colonies. So, you know, obviously that's something that doesn't really make sense, because you're just kind of looking at, you know, what an adult full sized colony. They'd also provide combs, or they'd only do for one season. So it was really, there were really lots of studies that were limited in sociometry, but none that really kind of brought them all together. And the best one actually was Juliana Rangel and Tom Seeley from 2012, where they actually followed colonies for a whole year. There were some limitations in that study, but this was probably the best one. The only problem with this one was that because they didn't go into multiple years, they couldn't really get the full reproductive patterns of colonies. That's what I was really interested in. So I guess at this point, maybe Stephen, just to make sure, I mean, the idea though that you're trying to follow these colonies from birth until death, did that kind of come through?
Yeah, I'm following. Yeah, I'm following. But anybody, if you want that to re-paraphrase, drop it in a question there, and we can do it that way if you need to.
Cool. And yeah, honestly, I'm pretty chill about just anyone that wants to drop in at any point and ask a question. I have a very small ego, so I'm not going to be bothered if anything doesn't make sense. Feel free to just interrupt me. So I'm going to keep kind of chugging along, and if that works out, but please do let me know, because literally I'm looking at my screen and just talking into the thin air. So
yeah.
Weird. So here's how you actually do this kind of thing. So you need to start with a swarm. And in this case, so what we do is so in this box, it's kind of like a package of bees. But what we do these package of bees is we feed them sugar syrup to just they're full to the brim with sugar syrup. We do this over a couple of days. And it's basically how you produce an artificial swarm. So we have a queen in there, and we have a number of bees in there that is about the size of what a swarm in the Ithaca region would look like. As a reminder, this is all being done in Ithaca, New York. And so we basically try to match all the natural conditions with this kind of swarm. So then we take that swarm, And what you see here is this is an observation hive. So you see the wooden boundaries here. There's glass on here, but of course you can see through the glass. And then the bees can enter and exit from this hole here. So this is basically an observation hive, which I imagine you've probably seen an observation hive, but I guarantee you've never seen an observation hive this big.
Yeah.
This observation hive is about 1 meter by 1 meter. It's really, really big. So then what you do is you take your swarm and you dump the bees into that observation hive. So now you can see that, this is the styrofoam cover on the back end. You can see all these bees in here, but there's absolutely no comb. Everything that colony wants or needs or will get, they have to do themselves. So we're really kind of just seeing what they would do in a natural setup. So this colony, they very quickly get to work and they start building comb. So now you can see here's this comb that they've built right here. You can see that they've attached it to the glass in some cases, but for the most part, they build it in plane with the wooden supports. So what we basically have is one gigantic sheet of comb. And then what we can do is we actually can put a piece of plastic. You might see a slight tinge of the plastic here on the edge. And we can put that transparent plastic on the glass. And then with a flashlight and a marker, we can kind of go through and say, okay, this is how much comb they have today. So we can just trace it all out. And we can say, okay, this is where the brood is. This is where the honey is. This is where the drone comb is. And we pretty much do that, once a week for the rest of their lives, until at some point your colony dies. So here's a colony when I cleaned it out in the springtime. They died over the winter. And so you can see like a bunch of dead bees that were all in here. They had died. And this is actually cleaning out. But even this image, we can actually get a lot of information. You might be able to see like this is the dark comb that's all stained from rearing brood. Over here we have honey stores that they still had left over when this colony unfortunately died. And if your eyes are really good, you might even be able to tell that there's some drone comb in here, the larger sized hexagons versus the hexagons over here that are much smaller. So that's basically, in a nutshell, it's markers, it's plastic, it's letting the bees do what they want to do. And so, like I mentioned, these plastic sheets, we have these plastic sheets that now are like an imprint of the colony. And we take a photograph, and then in Photoshop, we can actually measure out the different areas of the different contents of the nest. So over here, we'd have like some honey stores, some brood, some reproductive comb. So that's really the nitty gritty of how you actually get into this. So at this point, I'm just gonna read to you the data. I'm just gonna read the numbers that we collected each day. And I think that'll be really, really boring. That we're just gonna go through every single moment and just say how much comb they had versus how much drone comb they had and how much honey they had in those cells. But fortunately, I'm actually not gonna do that. I'm actually just gonna show you a video. Oh wait, here we go. So what we're gonna start with here, so you have the different things that can be in the comb. You have empty comb, you can have honey, you can have brood, or you can have pollen. And down here, we're gonna have the time of year, which is gonna slowly progress from July 2012 through September 2013. And we're gonna start with absolutely nothing here. This is the nest. And you're gonna see it grow slowly. And I'm gonna try to kind of point some things out as we go. So here we go. So let's see if this works. Nope, let's see. Okay, so here's the nest that's slowly growing. You can see they've got a lot of brood over here. Right over here, they start to build some drone comb, which is the lighter colored stuff. And you can see they don't actually use it for brood because it would be blue if they did. So we're now running into December. There's a drone comb over here. It's got some honey in it and it's empty. They got a little bit of brood throughout their year. At this point, I actually realized that I should be collecting the honey stores and the worker comb as well. The colony is slowly eating through their honey stores through the winter. You can see like slowly consuming, and now spring has sprung. They're building a lot of worker brood. Now they've started rearing these drones over here. Eventually this colony swarms, so they no longer have any brood, and then they get requeened. And now we're gonna see a second round of drone brood over here in this area. So this is a second late spring, and now this colony has fully filled its nest. You can see the whole thing is almost filled, and they're preparing for winter. That might have been that's probably a little fast. So let's watch it one more time. And I actually won't say anything. You can actually just kind of watch it. The things to note though is that at the beginning, I wasn't actually monitoring both the worker comb and the drone comb for its contents. So at some point in the winter, you'll see that everything really gets colorful. That's just because at some point over the winter, I started actually monitoring everything. I only had the total comb amount at the beginning. But let's see if this works. So here again in the winter, very little bit of brood. Long, long Ithaca winter. You can see they're slowly eating through their honey. And then things are gonna get really exciting, so I won't say anything so people can like watch the video. Cool. So that's, I mean, that's really, I mean, that's surprisingly, that's 2 years of my life right there, for better or worse. Which, yeah, welcome to the world of science.
Can I ask you a question, man? Between each picture, how long is there, like each snapshot, what's the duration difference? Is it every week or once a week or every two?
It's in the majority of cases, it's once per week. In the winter time, because we didn't want to be opening the colony so often, in some cases it was every 2 weeks, but for the majority of the cases it's every week.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And if any, you know, again, any questions anytime. So so what can you learn about a colony literally just by watching? And by watching, I mean watching them from a swarm here in this tree to the point that they're eventually dead. And I would actually argue that you can learn a heck of a lot about a colony just by watching them and letting them do what they would naturally do in their natural environment without any kind of manipulations. You know, notice that, you know, I was never harvesting honey from that colony. I wasn't, you know, I wasn't doing anything. I was literally just like letting them do whatever they wanted to do. If they swarmed, that was what they did. If they reared drones, that's what they did. It's really just kind of like live and let live. So what I'd like to do is actually go through some of these different results, and I'm going to kind of, I'm only highlighting some of them because there's a really lot in that story, but I kind of want to highlight on things that I think would be interesting to you guys. So one of those things is how does the number of workers and drones change over the course of the year in these natural colonies? And so there are 4 colonies that we did this with: the north, south, east, and office. And each one of them kind of had a different story. So I'm going to kind of show you each one of them in their own case. So in black, we have the number of workers. In blue, we have the number of drones. And this north colony, so this is where the swarm was installed right here. And you can see they have a real free fall dive when there's no new bees emerging. And then they start to recover. But by here, it's October, November, and they slowly die over the winter. And this colony, it had a 93% winter loss. 93% of the bees died that year. And you can see that as they came out of the spring the next year, they got some workers, but it never really kind of got back into the real swing of things. It really did not do very well.
I got a question for you here.
Yeah.
From Garrett. How do you count the workers and drones? Presumably it's just estimates.
Oh yeah, so yeah, good question. So the way we do that is, so you remember like the glass? What we actually do is we actually have a system of squares, 4 by 4 centimeter squares. And so what we do is at nighttime, once a month, so it has to be at nighttime because you want all the bees at home. So we count a subset of those squares, and you literally just put this square on there and you say, okay, how many workers and how many drones can I see in this square? And then you repeat that many, many times, and you can get an estimate of the total colony size. And that's how we get our population counts.
So you can only do it at nighttime. It's pointless otherwise.
I mean, you could do it at daytime, but if you did it in the day, then the bees that are out foraging, you wouldn't necessarily count them because they would be outside of the nest. So that's why we do it at night. Yeah. So this north colony, you know, you're going to see some things are going to be similar, some are going to be different. So let's see, what about this east colony? So this colony again has a dive, and then they recover, and then they kind of slowly peter away through the winter. It's very, you know, slow season. They can't really do much. And then bam, right here in April, the number of workers just skyrockets. This star, this asterisk, means that they swarmed. You can see that the number of bees quickly drops. It keeps recovering, and then they also emit an after swarm, so a secondary swarm with an unmated queen. It dives again, and then the number of workers that once the colony requeens, it quickly recovers again until again we have that kind of loss over the winter. You can also see in this colony there's no drones in that first year, and then there's a nice spike of drones later in the year. So now the south colony again has this dive and a recovery from the swarming and then a long winter. And then here in between April and May, I actually noticed that this colony had lost its queen. And instead of letting that colony just peter out and die, I actually requeened this colony because I didn't want to lose one of my 4 colonies. So I requeened it at this point, and then you can see that they were able to recover and they build up a lot of workers, but this colony never swarmed. But they were able to build to rear a lot of drones every year. So they did rear drones, but they didn't swarm. And so this last colony, the office colony that was actually in my office, I'm going to move this. So this colony again had that same dive and then a recovery, then the slow winter loss. And then this colony again built up quickly, swarmed, lose a lot of bees, built up, after swarmed, loses a lot of bees. And then the weirdest thing, later in the year, in August, so this is August over here, the colony swarms, indicated by that first asterisk, and then in early September, it casts an after swarm, which I'll be really honest, I still have no idea why they did that. So, I mean, this colony really was almost like a swarm mania. They really went whole hog on reproduction, and they killed themselves in the process. Yeah. You can see the number of drones here as well. They were able to rear quite a few drones in this colony as well between the months of May, June, July, August. They were able to rear a lot of drones. So if we were to think of these 4 colonies like kind of giving them like typecast, we'd say this north colony, yeah, they survived the winter, but they never really recovered. They didn't really survive. They kind of like petered along. The east colony is what I would maybe call your ideal child, in that it grew, it swarmed, it after swarmed, and then it recovered, and it would have survived that second winter. The south colony would be what I'd call like a non-swarmer, but they still reproduced via drones. So they still did invest in reproduction. And then the office colony, I would call like a swarm yourself to deather. Like they just kept reproducing. They kept casting these swarms, and they just ended up kicking the bucket because they swarmed so much. So now I'm going to switch to a different metric that we can look at and how that changes, and look at comb building. And this is something that's really personal to, I like comb building. I think it's really cool. So this north colony again, so this is the comb area in black and the drone comb area in blue. And you can see the colony gets installed here, and they very, very quickly build a ton of comb, and then it kind of slows down. And then this colony didn't really build much comb for the rest of their lives. But they did build comb in that first year. So they did build a little bit of drone comb. The east colony, so this is the one that actually kind of really lived and flourished in 2 years. You can see they build a ton of comb right away. It kind of slows down, and then later they build a lot of comb. And then you have this long period where they don't build any comb, and then the next year they start building worker comb again. So they build comb in both first year and the second year, and they build a little bit of it drone comb in the first year, and that kind of stays the same. And then the next year they build more of it kind of gradually. So the south colony, we're seeing the really quick building of the worker comb. Later they build that drone comb, and again this colony also in the second year builds some comb. And the office colony again, really strong comb growth at the beginning, and then also in their second year, and they also built some of that drone comb in the beginning. So if you're interested in drone comb, which as a beekeeper you might be like, Michael, I hate drone comb. Why would you ever want to work on that? I still find it interesting though. What we can learn just by watching the bees, not doing really anything else, we can now really solidly say that, okay, these colonies, they build that drone comb in the first year, but they don't use it in that first year. So even though they invested in reproduction by building that drone comb, they didn't actually make any drones in it. So it's kind of like an early reproductive investment. And then the other thing that's really interesting is that the majority of the drone comb that they eventually built was actually built in their second year. So 87% of the drone comb that was eventually built in these colonies was built in the second year, versus 33% that was built of the worker comb in that second year. So the idea is that this colony moves in, they build a ton of worker comb, they build a little bit of drone comb, And then the next year, they actually invest more in that drone comb, and they still fill out their nest with some more worker comb as well. But the bulk of that drone comb gets built in the second year. But for me, that was really important, was that to know that colonies will build drone comb really quickly in their lives. So if we also now, we can actually also investigate what was actually in the combs that they built. And so I'm actually going to, so what these plots are is, the top line is showing you how much comb there is, and then the colors are showing you what's in the comb. So whether it's pollen or brood or honey or empty comb. And so this North colony, again, is a really weird colony. And they did rear some, they did try to rear worker brood. So this blue is the worker brood that they tried to rear, but unfortunately they weren't able to maintain it, and they just kept trying to rear worker brood and it just kept dying. And they actually ended up rearing some of the drone eggs in that worker comb. So they're actually, the queen was actually laying drone eggs in that worker comb. This East colony, so we can see here, you have a lot of brood being reared, a lot of worker brood. And then of course the colony swarms, so then you have no worker brood, and the new queen comes back, and then you have more of that brood coming in. Versus how they use their drone comb, they actually have two blips of rearing drones. So they have the drone comb right here, and then the colony swarms, and then you have a second bout of that drone comb in August and September. So they kind of go through 2 rounds of drone brood investment. And we kind of see the same thing with the South colony. Now remember, this is the colony with the arrow where I had to requeen this colony. And so what's really interesting about this colony is they never swarmed, but they invested a ton in drone comb. So you see this colony here, they have this much drone comb, and then they really went crazy on the amount of drone comb that they built. And they were also able to rear 2 bouts of these drones. So they built an early bout of drones and a later bout of drones. And so this is the last colony, this office colony that had the weird kind of double swarming feature that eventually was their demise. So you can see again, they have a bout of worker brood, they swarm, they have another bout of worker brood, they swarm again, and then they kind of tried to over here, but it was just too late. And keep in mind that this colony this is all gray comb, is empty comb. They have absolutely no honey stores. They're really kind of flying by the seat of their pants, I guess you could say. And again, this colony has 2 bouts of this drone brood. So those are all the colonies in there. So at this point, you might be saying, okay, Michael, can you tell us anything that we didn't know? You know, bees build comb, they build drone comb, you know, there's brood, and you know, if you're skeptical, you might be like, well, you know, your work is worthless, and that's, you know, that's fine. You're welcome to say that. But what I would say though is that, you know, this is actually really important kind of baseline information about how colonies live when they're not being managed by honeybees. So if we think of the different stages of a bee's life, a colony's life, from the point where it's founded, the ergonomic stage is where it really builds and grows. You can think of like a period of strong growth, and reproductive stages. So you can see that this, you know, you start with a swarm, they invest a ton in their worker comb, they start to invest a little bit in reproduction by building that drone comb, and then eventually in their second year, they actually cast those swarms. So what I can say actually is that, so 60% of that first year comb is built in the first month.
Wow.
So think about that for a colony. Like, of all the comb that you're gonna build in that first year, 60% of it is done in the first 30 days. In terms of switching from worker comb to drone comb, for the 4 colonies, that happened 39 plus or minus 5 days after installation. So think about that. You know, within 40 days of moving into a new nest, that colony is already thinking about investing in reproduction. And the other thing that I can definitely say is, you know, these colonies, you know, 2 of the 4 swarmed. I'd say like the 2, what we might call like normal colonies, swarmed. But not only did they swarm, anytime they swarmed, they also cast an after swarm. And so this is something that maybe as beekeepers we don't think about, but it's natural for colonies to swarm, but it's also natural for them to after swarm. And so that, you know, that maybe has implications for varroa and kind of other reproductive things. But, you know, these are things that, you know, without just watching the bees, you'd never really know these things. So another kind of...
Sorry, Michael, can I interrupt you again for a question here? Garrett is asking, do you think there is a correlation between sudden drone building / drones and no swarming?
Yeah, you know, I've never done an experiment that explicitly tested that, where you prevent a colony from swarming and then see how much more they might invest in drones. You know, I think we have a suggestive, I don't want to say, you know, it's not proven or anything, but I think we have a suggestive result in that one colony that wasn't able to swarm, that they really did invest so heavily in drones. But that's really something that you know, you'd have to do a real controlled experiment for that. But what I would say, and I'll put my hands up on this one, is, you know, that might not be something you'd think about unless you had done the sociometry study where you just sat and watched the colonies. Yeah, and if there's follow-ups on those, by all means, I'm happy to answer. I'm going to keep going just in case. I mean, I just want to make sure that I don't want to keep you guys up too late.
I don't know, you're right. This is really interesting.
So here's kind of an interesting kind of, you know, this is what I would call like an out of the corner of your eyes kind of result, the kind of thing that you didn't really think about, but then later you're like, oh, wow, that's interesting. So reproductive investments. In the first year, the colonies, their only reproductive investment they did was they built that drone comb. So I was really interested in like, okay, thinking about the colony, how big were those colonies when they started building drone comb? And it turns out in that first year, they started building drone comb once the colony had roughly 6,000-ish workers, let's say over here. So that's 5,900, you know, that don't get too caught up on that number. And then in the second year, so this is the drone comb. So remember this North colony, they didn't invest in drone brood in the drone comb at all. But you think, when did they first start investing in drone brood in the second year? Because remember, the first reproductive investment the first year was drone comb. In the second year, it was actually using the drone comb. And so how many workers were in the colony when they first started rearing drone brood? And the number for that was roughly about the same, 5,500 plus or minus 800 bees was when they started investing in drone brood in their second year. So those numbers, at least to me, look really similar. You know, it's about 5,000 to 6,000 bees is what it takes to first start making those reproductive investments, whether it's your first year or your second year. In the first year, it was your drone comb. In your second year is your drone brood. But there was something about having about 6,000 bees. And I don't know about you guys, but you know, I'm also a beekeeper. And to me, gosh, like the thought of 6,000 bees as being the kind of threshold for starting to invest in reproduction, that just seems so small. But at the same time, you know, when you let the bees live their own lives, at least in Ithaca, New York, at least in this situation, it seems like, you know, they start making those reproductive investments, you know, at a colony size that we as beekeepers might think is just tiny. So another thing, and I mean, I know you might get bored of this, but I just think drones are so cool. But you know, so for a lot of these colonies, so when a colony swarms, 72% of the workers leave the nest. It's 2/3, 70% of that colony leaves, it just evacuates. But what I noticed was that when the colonies left, and I'd have to catch these swarms to find out how many bees left the nest. What I noticed was that there were so few drones in those swarms. And so, for example, when the office colony departed, of 2,000 drones, only 100 plus departed with the swarm. Only 5% of those drones left that colony. So think of this scenario. A colony is swarming. 70% of the workers leave, but only 5% of the drones leave. How are these drones being able to distinguish that, oh, there's a swarm being cast and I need to stay at home? Now you might think, okay, well, maybe it's a safe option to stay at home. You know, swarming is a very dangerous thing. You know, you go out, you're left outside, you have to eventually find a new colony. You know, what good are drones outside? But surprisingly, actually, those drones had stayed at home. In one of those cases, the workers then killed all of the drones. From one day to the next, all of the drones were murdered. There's a thick layer of dead drones at the bottom of the nest. So I wouldn't necessarily, it's a safe option, but I think this kind of just looking and seeing kind of it leads you to interesting questions that are biologically relevant about how do drones decide, you know, how do drones make the decision to leave or stay at home? And, you know, even if there is like a real, I wouldn't know if I'd call that a decision, but just, you know, how that kind of works. Another thing that, so I feel like, I mean, on timing, I'll mention it anyways, but another thing, so maybe the astute of you might have noticed that in some cases, it looks like the amount of comb shrinks. Like, so imagine this colony, the east colony, like the comb grows, but then here it kind of goes down. And it's like, well, Michael, like once they built the comb, did you kind of make a mistake there? And at first I thought that maybe I had made a mistake, But what actually happens is, this is in like September, October, November, the bees actually chew away at the edges of the comb, and they actually shrink the combs a little bit. I think they use that wax for other parts of the nest. So you actually have these colonies that actually kind of slightly shrink. The bees are so economical. So this is an image here of the bees where they're building comb at these edges. They actually will shave down the edges of these to kind of actually use that wax elsewhere. So they don't actually produce wax, they will actually recycle the wax. So you might now be saying, well, Michael, you did an experiment and you were supposed to answer some questions instead of give us more questions. And I'd tell you actually tough, because I'm a scientist and I'm not a politician. I'm not here to just answer questions. I'm here to come up with more questions. But what I can say is that at least my questions can be based on real things as opposed to whatever it is that politicians say. So hopefully no one's too offended by that. And I take no questions about any politics in any country. I live in Germany right now, so no comment on anything. So just to kind of get back to the idea of sociometry is that, I think it's easy for researchers to kind of get carried away with like cool ideas of, oh, what might be interesting or what would be cool. But really, you should always start with a descriptive phase where you really thoroughly describe your study system. So if you think of these like 3 trucks here, like a racing truck versus a bee truck versus a kind of big diesel truck. If you wanted to compare those trucks and how fast they go and how they use fuel, like what their fuel economy is, how much cargo they can carry, how many people they can carry. If you want to compare those trucks, surely you need to have blueprints of those trucks first. And so that's really what sociometry is all about. It's about building a blueprint of a colony to then ask questions that are relevant to what colonies actually do in a natural state. With this, I also am I'm totally accepting that there are lots of shortcomings. I am working with observation hives. So in an observation hive, you have a 2-dimensional versus a 3-dimensional nest. So imagine, this is my observation hive where the bees are all forced into 2 dimensions. Versus in a natural nest, you'd actually have a 3-dimensional nest that would have that more form. Colony density, these are all at a lab. So there's many more colonies in the environment than you would have if you were a bee colony in the middle of a tree in the middle of nowhere. And I agree, I only have 4 colonies and this is only in one location. So, you could think of a sociometry study being very, very different if you did this in, in the tropics, if you did this in Ireland, if you did this in, any country, you might actually have different kind of findings. So I'm very open about the shortcomings of this, but I do think it's really important to do these kinds of studies. And unfortunately, most people don't really publish them because I'll be honest, they're a lot of work. Yeah. So at this point, I'd like to pose if there's any questions about the sociometry side of things, and then we're going to kind of switch gears. So any questions?
I have a question there. Let people type for a second. The source of bees, are they the feral Ithaca bees or are they kind of package purchase bees, or what's the story with that?
So for these, we don't purchase, they're naturally mated wild colonies, just the Ithaca hodgepodge. So we're not selecting specific we're not getting packages from southern Georgia or anything like that. It's local Ithaca bees. And keep in mind also that when those colonies swarm and the queen goes to mate, she's mating with whatever drones are in the area. So we really have zero control over those colonies after they mate.
None of the colonies, because I just was interested to see if there was a difference between, say, commercial strains considered in comparison to a feral strain. Would they kind of build more comb? Would they do more or less strong comb? You just stuck with the feral kind.
Yeah, in our case, especially in the Ithaca, New York area, we have a really harsh winter. I mean, in terms of like, if you want a place with 4 seasons, Ithaca's got 4 strong seasons. And one of those seasons, winter, is extremely strong. So, I mean, we really wanted to deal with bees that were locally adapted to our area. We didn't necessarily want to be doing experiments with California bees that are used to Southern California, namby-pamby, wimpy winter.
Yeah.
But again, that's a case where, you really could imagine doing a kind of sociometry study where you had some natural colonies and some California colonies, and you could really compare the two to kind of see how things differ.
Cool. There's no questions at the minute. If you want to continue, anyone?
People.
Oh, sorry, got a question.
I'm in a room and it's.
Okay, Michael. So Kim asks, the drones in the graph increasing in, say, April, May, the swarms occurred, and then there is an increase in drone production in August, September. What is that investment in drone production related to? I'm in North Carolina, and we don't really consider swarming that late in the year.
Yeah, really, really good question. So that second blip of drones, for a while I was like, this is so weird. Why are they doing this? Is this just something weird about my setup? And I actually looked in the literature, and there actually are reports of drone production having two blips. And what we think that second blip is for colonies that might naturally be requeening themselves later in the season. So you can think of a colony, if they have a queen that's not doing very well, that they might actually replace her queen. Not necessarily that they would swarm, but they would replace a queen in August, September. And so then that queen would still need to mate with potential drones. You could also think of it as when a colony goes into winter, winter is a very, very tough time for a colony. And so you could think of this as also a case, well, a colony kind of giving a last-ditch effort to gain some reproduction potentially before going into the winter, because surviving winter is very difficult for colonies. But yeah, so the idea of that second blip is that it could be used for other colonies that are requeening in the area. I don't know if that answer.
Social stuff like the swarming is like a process of, I don't know if the word exists, but like it's a social service almost, is it?
Well, I wouldn't think of it. So, I mean, when I think of a social service, I think of doing something selflessly, like something that I would do, like I'm going to, give money to charity.
Yeah.
I don't think of these bees as necessarily being charitable or social in that way. I think of it more as, when you think of that colony, they're going to do their best to reproduce and spread their genes. And if there's a way to get some advantage and some potential for reproduction, they will capture it at any cost. And, one of the colonies to think about that was that office colony. They even swarmed in August. And yeah, we definitely would not think of August as being a good time of year to swarm. But, maybe that colony just had a mismatch with what it thought was viable for that year. And they just, there was some slim hope that they could, if we had had an exceptionally mild winter, that maybe they would have survived. But no, that colony definitely did not make it. And those swarms wouldn't have made it either. They all would have died. But yeah, reproduction is a powerful thing. Organisms spend a lot on reproduction, and it's how you get the next generation of colonies.
Another question here from Garrett. Did you do Varroa count during any of these studies?
No, we didn't count for Varroa. And yeah, I would have loved to have done Varroa counts. One thing is, we can't do an alcohol wash or a sugar shake because you can't. These observation hives, they're huge, and you have the wax. It's the wax, they actually even sometimes attach it to the walls, the glass. So to open them up, you really would end up destroying the colony once they're in there. So you can't like pull the bees out. I guess one could, you could modify some kind of sticky board thing to kind of slide in there and get like a 24-hour mite count, but you wouldn't be able to do, you wouldn't be able to test cells for Varroa mites. You wouldn't be able to test for Varroa mites on workers either. Yeah.
I have one question, and I might be way off. The orientation of the office colony, was that, see, you had the north ones seemed to be, and tell me if I'm wrong, the north ones seemed to do the worst.
Yeah.
And the east ones seemed to do better. And the office one, was that orientated to like north, south, east, west? What was it, if you know?
That office colony was also oriented north. Yeah.
So
yeah.
You reckon there's a correlation between the sun? Because like there's lads that I've heard tell me that the way you position your hive, that the entrance gets the sun, makes a difference. Is there anything in that, or am I completely off?
Yeah, no, southern exposure is really important for colonies. So that very well could be one of the problems with the office colony and the northern colony. One of the things that also I would kind of say that was potentially a problem with the office colony is that it was in my office. And because it's in my office is kept somewhat warm. So the bees in the office colony would not have experienced as harsh of a winter as the other colonies.
Yeah.
So there really is if I were to do the study again, I would not have any colony face north. I would have them all face east, south, or west. And having a colony in your office, I mean, I loved it because it was nice to have a colony in my office and, you know, be able to hear them buzzing along. But yeah, I mean, it could be that that was a problem for the colony. At the same time, when bees are assessing natural sites, they do prefer southern entrances, but they also will kind of take whatever they can get.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so there's a case there. It's like, well, they have to kind of do with what they have.
Last question from me. There doesn't seem to be any left, but did you get a chance to track or capture any of the off swarms? When did you get to, I know it probably would have been a ton of work, but like how they got on, or did you have any traps set up for them or anything like that?
Yeah, so as many of the swarms and after swarms as I could catch, I would catch them, weigh them to know how many bees were in there, and then I would usually put them in equipment for, you know, basically for the rest of our bee setup. But I did not actually, I didn't then, you know, you could imagine a sociometry study where then you actually also follow the offspring and see how well they do.
Yeah, oh, Jesus, it take forever. Like,
yeah, I mean, you know, it would be a cool study to do. The problem with that is that you then, you know, because these observation hives are so large, you can't really keep a lot of them in a lot of places. So you're somewhat space restricted. Yeah. What we do know though is from actually work done by Juliana Rangel and Tom Seeley was that the number of bees that are in a swarm is the best predictor for a swarm surviving their first winter. So the larger the swarm or after swarm, the better the chance that they will survive that first winter. And so in their study, they actually had large swarms, medium-sized swarms, small swarms, and the large swarms had the best survival there. So we can actually estimate how likely it is for a colony to survive based on the number of workers. But, you know, that's you'd have to take that with a grain of salt.
In a previous experiment, you wanted to remove the artificial heating of the building from the room.
Yes.
And then that caused a problem or something, didn't it?
Yeah, so that was for the sociometry study. In the first winter, we didn't heat the room where the colonies were kept, but we didn't let it drop to very, very cold. So we kept it at about 5 centigrade, the room. But the bee colonies are still exposed to the outside, so they're still getting a lot of cold air moving in.
Yeah.
But in the second year, so because it actually already gone through 2 years, I thought, okay, for that second winter, why don't we just leave the room to completely go as cold as it will get. And unfortunately, those colonies died that winter, and they still had plenty of honey. And I think it was because living in a 2-dimensional nest is not the most natural thing, and they're exposed to the glass, so that's also wicking away a lot of heat. So in retrospect, I think it was good to let the colonies get cold so that they would actually form a winter cluster. But having, you know, Ithaca, New York can get to, you know, negative 20 centigrade, and that's just you know, that's just too darn cold. Yeah.
Especially in glass.
Yeah, especially on glass and everything. Yeah, I mean, it was just too much for them. The good news is that it ended my experiment though, so I didn't have to follow the third year.
We have another question from Kim. Is there ever a feasible opportunity to do a sociometry specific projects between researchers and beekeepers in the bee yard, where beekeepers' observations and data sets could contribute to managed 3D colony or bee yard research?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a potential for that kind of stuff. You know, I think to do it properly, you'd really have to organize it in a way that would make it simple for everyone. And simple for everyone, I mean, is like for the researchers, they'd want to be able to really know that they were getting reliable and good information. But the other thing that's difficult for beekeepers is that, you know, for those colonies that I had, like, it, you know, for some of them, it's like I would just let them die. And I think that can be really hard for, you know, as someone who also keeps bees, it can be really hard to be like, okay, like for the data, I'm just going to let this colony die. And now, I mean, I did requeen that one colony. You know, that was because, you know, I had 4 colonies and I was like, shoot, I don't want to lose, you know, one of my 4 colonies in the first year. You know, I probably, you know, that colony, you know, could have counted as a colony that died. but it's the kind of thing where it's, if you were working with a lot of beekeepers, that, there might be some cases where it's like, okay, well, my colony is going to die, so maybe I should feed it. But then from the researcher side, you'd be like, well, if you feed it, it actually means that it's not good information anymore. So yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely opportunities to do that kind of stuff, but I think it would definitely need to be like really well organized and in a broad scale kind of thing.
Kim said that was absolutely fantastic in capitals. Obviously, that means you were deadly. Many thanks. And I will say, Michael, thank you so much for your time, especially for hand marking. Was it 5,673 bees?
5,343.
That's, dude, fair play.
Too many bees.
Too many bees. We all owe you a massive debt of gratitude for your research.
Well, we'll really, those results are coming through now, so we'll really see what we find. But who knows? It's research.
How long do you reckon until you're finished?
My fellowship ends at the end of this year, and so then I will most likely be returning to the U.S. Hopefully to start at Auburn University. So, fingers crossed. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, I mean, I definitely have funding for the end of this year, so it's time to write up results and kind of get those things done.
Michael, thank you very much. Have a great evening, and everybody else, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
All the best.
Yeah.
Bye bye.